By the pricking of my thumbs, something wicked this way comes.
Let's talk about Shakespeare. Right now, I'm sure some of you are excited and others are probably wondering why we're talking about Shakespeare on a horror show. By the end of this video, I hope to have you convinced that some of Shakespeare's work, Macbeth in particular, actually fits really well within the horror genre. In order to do that, we need to look at a lot of elements of Macbeth. As I see it, there are roughly 5 overlapping elements that contribute to the horrific nature of Macbeth. The character arc involving a fall from grace, corruption, and guilt, the plotline involving murder, the ghosts and apparitions, the witches, and finally, the thread of equivocation or ambiguity that exists throughout the entire play. Though each element alone is like a single instrument in the orchestra, and it's only together that they have the desired effect, we'll still look at each one in turn. I should warn you, this entire video is going to be full of spoilers. On some level, I hardly feel like I should need to put a spoiler warning on a discussion of Shakespeare. But I also know there are some people out there who, for whatever reason, have never read or seen Macbeth. If you're one of them and you don't want me to spoil every little detail of the entire play in minute analytical detail, I'll forgive you if you turn my video off for now and come back to it after you've read or seen the play. Just make sure you subscribe to my channel so you don't forget. In fact, even if you watch this video now, do go ahead and subscribe and ring the notification bell so you don't miss any of the other creepy goodness I have planned. With that warning out of the way, let's dig into the horrors of Macbeth. First, though, I need to say a few words about Shakespeare in general. As Teller, who was a master magician and co-director of what I consider the finest production of Macbeth that I've ever seen, and to which I'll leave a link down in the What's It, as Teller once said, the idea that Shakespeare is somehow austere and tasteful is just insane. While it's arguably true that Shakespeare is the finest wordsmith in the history of the English language, and it's inarguably true that he's at least among the finest, it's also a simple fact that in his day he was writing popular entertainment. Of course, not all of his stories are horror, just as not all popular entertainment is horror today. But it's certainly the case that though horror as a genre hadn't really been invented yet, Shakespeare's audience undoubtedly contained the same kinds of people who today turn out to watch the latest slasher flick.
Stars, hide your fires. Let not light see my black and deep desires. The eye wink at the hand, yet let that be what the eye fears when it is done to see.
Let's talk about murder. Of course, not every story about murder is a horror story. There's a whole world of action movies, mystery novels, and more that prominently feature murder, yet aren't horror stories. However, I'm going to argue that the murders in Macbeth are specifically the stuff of horror stories. There are a number of ways, I think, that that's the case. The fact of the matter is, murder is at the center of Macbeth. The entire action of the play centers around a murder and the string of murders that take place directly as a result of that first one. Let's talk about some numbers. Many of my fellow horror movie nerds often obsess over body counts, the number of people killed by the serial killer, maniac, or monster in some movie or franchise. And some of the numbers can get quite impressive. Jason Voorhees alone has racked up more than 150 kills, but that took him an entire film franchise to achieve. And let's face it, those movies are about the kill count more than they're really about any deep psychological feelings of horror. So where does Macbeth stack up? Let's just count the murders. The play opens when Macbeth kills MacDonald. Yes, this was a battle death rather than a murder, but because it sets the whole thing off, we're going to count it anyway. Plus, though you might not actually see the death in most productions of the play, it's described in detail worthy of any horror story. He unseamed him from the nave to the chops, and fixed his head upon our battlements. The real driving force of the play is discovered when Macbeth murders King Duncan in his sleep. This is immediately followed by 2 more murders as Macbeth kills 2 drunken guards and frames them for the king's murder. But not all of Macbeth's murders were directly committed by his own hand. He ordered the death of Banquo, who we'll discuss in some detail shortly. He also ordered the murder of the entire Macduff household. We don't know how many people that involved, but we know it involved, at the very least, Lady Macduff and Macduff's son. We can also infer that there were numerous others, because Macduff, upon hearing this news, says, "All my pretty ones? Did you say all? Oh, Hellkite, all? What, all my pretty chickens in their dam at one fell swoop?" That certainly suggests a larger death toll than merely 2. We can also reasonably infer this particular murder may have involved any number of servants or other ancillary deaths. Finally, Macbeth returns to doing his own dirty work when he kills young Seward near the end of the play. While this is again a death in battle rather than a murder in the dark of night, it nevertheless counts. So where does that place our total? Macbeth kills 4 people directly in the play, but he's responsible for at least 7 either by direct action or commission, and we can justifiably assume that the number is much higher, including several unnamed members of the Macduff family, and however many fell in battles resulting directly from Macbeth's actions. That number might not compare to the body count of someone like Jason Voorhees or Michael Myers or Freddy Krueger, but let's not forget that Psycho only had a body count of 2, and it's considered one of the greatest horror movies ever. Similarly, Cape Fear boasts a kill count of only 3, plus a dog, and the xenomorph in the first Alien movie only gets 5. And don't give me the "we only need to count the direct murders" nonsense. If we play that game, Jigsaw has a body count of 0, and for that matter, so does Charles Manson. Murders by commission still count as murders, not only in law, but also in horror stories. So we can agree, the body count at least puts Macbeth in the running for being a horror story. But body count alone does not make it horror. If that were the case, John Wick would be one of the greatest horror icons ever. And every war movie would be a horror movie. And whether that's the case or not is the subject of a philosophical discussion way beyond what we have time for here. Even within the world of Shakespeare, there are plays with comparable body counts that don't count as horror stories. Romeo and Juliet ends with 6 people dead, and none of us should be crazy enough to call that really a real horror story. So what is it about the murders in Macbeth specifically that make it a horror story rather than just a violent story? One element surely that moves it in that direction is that many of the murders are of complete innocence. Unlike all the deaths in a movie like John Wick, where it's specifically armed bad guys dropping like flies, and unlike the deaths in war movies in which the deaths are of combatants on both sides, the deaths in Macbeth are, with only a few exceptions, actually murders. That alone doesn't make it a horror story, but it does move it in the right direction. Consider the deaths of the Macduff family. Though we only see hints of the horrors of that scene in the play, we need to acknowledge what's actually happening. Fundamentally, this is a home invasion scene that ends with the deaths of an entire family, including young children. But to really take it from being merely a tragic and somewhat horrific story of violence and turn it into a proper horror story, we need some psychological elements. To understand those, we can consider our second element, that of the fall from grace, corruption, and guilt.
I've almost forgot the taste of fears. Time has been, my sense would have cooled to hear a night shriek, and my fill of hair would at a dismal treatise rouse and stir as if life were in it. I have supped full with horrors. Direness, familiar to my slaughterous thoughts, cannot once start me. Wherefore was that cry?
The queen, my lord, is dead.
She should have died hereafter. There would have been a time for such a word. Tomorrow. And tomorrow. And tomorrow. Creeps in this petty pace from day to day, to the last syllable of recorded time. And all our yesterdays have lighted fools the way to dusty death. Out, out, brief candle. Life's but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage, and then is heard no more. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing.
Arguably one of the most horrific things that can happen in all of horror literature is the corruption of the good person. Many horror stories have explored the idea of what it takes to take a good man and lead him to commit atrocities. Others have explored the self-justifications of the already corrupted. As an example, consider the novel Survivor by J.F. Gonzalez. Ostensibly a story about evil people who kidnap a woman with aims to make a snuff film, the novel derives much of its truly horrific power when it begins to explore the things the victim is willing to do in order to preserve her own life. The fall from grace is a powerful idea in literature. Indeed, as far back as the fall of Lucifer himself, stories have long explored the idea that even the best among us can so easily become the worst among us. It's an idea ripe for exploration in horror. It's truly a horrific idea, after all, that the very people or institutions in which we place our greatest trust could ultimately be our undoing. So how does that apply to Macbeth? Well, it's a story as old as time. Power corrupts, after all. Macbeth begins the play described as brave Macbeth, the war hero. He's even honored for his bravery and fundamental goodness by the very king he will soon murder. In a lovely twist of Shakespearean irony, Duncan calls Macbeth noble at the end of Act 1, Scene 2. And what goes wrong? Simply put, it's his desire for power. Whether instigated by the witches, who we'll discuss later on, or Lady Macbeth, who certainly plays her role in Macbeth's corruption, or even just the corrupting influence of his own desire for absolute power, a desire that runs deep in human nature, is almost irrelevant. Scholars have long debated the exact cause or causes of Macbeth's corruption. For our purposes, we don't need to settle that debate. We simply need to realize the horror inherent in the corruption. Macbeth, brave Macbeth, the war hero, the favorite son, ended up being the very murderous threat that surely costs any king a good night's sleep. We can translate the same thought into more mundane horrors relevant to our own lives. We needn't think of kings and thanes. Horror fiction, and unfortunately the daily news, is filled with stories in which those we most trust end up doing us the greatest harm. It's horrific on an internal level because it forces us to corrupt the fact that, as Alexander Solzhenitsyn reminds us, the line separating good and evil passes not through states, nor between classes, nor between political parties either, but right through every human heart. Even within hearts overwhelmed by evil, one small bridgehead of good is retained, and even in the best of all hearts, there remains an uprooted small corner of evil. The idea that any of us could ultimately be the force of evil, despite our best intentions, is a terrifying one. In fact, I'd go as far as to say that if this idea doesn't keep you awake at night, you're not thinking about it hard enough. But it's also horrific on an external level. Just as it may force us to confront our own demons, it also forces us to confront the fact that none of us ever really knows another person. Not perfectly. Not enough to know that our loved ones, our friends, our trusted confidants would never do us any harm. That horror is compounded in Macbeth because the play is filled with manifestations of a guilty mind. While some of those manifestations appear as ghosts, which we'll discuss in a moment, it's actually not a ghost that gives us the most horrifying scene of guilt in the play. Easily one of the most horrific scenes, not only in Macbeth, but in all of literature, is the scene in which a guilt-ridden and sleepwalking Lady Macbeth attempts to wash her hands of the blood she imagines still stains them. It gives us a few of the most memorable lines ever to grace the stage. "Out, damned spot! Out, I say! 1, 2, why then 'tis time to do it! Hell is murky! Fie, my lord, fie! A soldier and afeard? What need we fear who knows it, when none can call our power to account? Yet who would have thought the old man to have had so much blood in him?" If that isn't the horrifying torment of a guilty mind, I don't know what is. By her own testimony, she knows damned well that she and Macbeth have gotten away with their crimes. As she says, none can call their power to account. And yet, she's haunted by bloody images. Her mind can't shake the image of how much blood has been spilled as a result partly of her own actions, and she imagines that blood to be a stain she can't wash from her hands. The best staging of this scene I've ever seen really brought the point home in a visual way. In Teller and Aaron Posner's production of Macbeth, which I mentioned before, starring Kate Eastwood Norris as Lady Macbeth, the audience is given a rare glimpse into her mind. When she stands on stage delivering those famous lines, she begins scrubbing her empty hands together. Yet as she continues, the blood she sees gradually appears to the audience until she's so covered with blood she looks like she might instead be performing the prom scene from Carrie. With visuals like that, it's obvious that the Teller-Posner production belongs in a discussion of horror. But I'd argue that though I love that visual, created using Teller's knowledge as a master magician, the real horror of the scene remains internal. Though hopefully none of us have killed anyone, there's not a human being alive who doesn't viscerally understand the way guilt can eat someone from the inside out. Lady Macbeth's guilt ultimately results in her own demise, emphasizing the power of that particular emotion. Macbeth's own guilt is not as easily expressed in a single quotation, but it's a constant thread throughout the entire play. It begins even before the murders have taken place in a hypothetical, contemplative sort of way, as it gradually becomes clear to the audience that his thinking is not correct and that he's descending into a kind of madness. Though we'll discuss that in a moment. But though Macbeth seems to constantly express his guilt, it's near the very end of the play that his guilt finally works itself out. It's upon hearing that his wife has died that his fall is completed. As indicated with the quotation that opened this section, his battle between guilt and self-justification has taken such a toll on him that he's no longer even able to properly mourn the death of his wife. Instead, he's fallen into nihilism. One of the lessons of a lot of great literature, and much of horror fiction in particular, is that people seldom actually get away with anything. In Macbeth, we're able to trace this corruption and fall from grace right from the beginning, as it ultimately destroys two characters in completely different ways. There's profound horror in Lady Macbeth experiencing so much guilt that she ends her own life. There's perhaps even more horror in Macbeth becoming so mentally twisted by his own guilt that he's no longer able to find any meaning in life at all. The most famous manifestation of Macbeth's guilt, though, is the appearance of ghosts.
Avaunt and quit my sight, let the earth hide thee. Thy bones are marrowless, thy blood is cold, thou hast no speculation in those eyes which thou dost glare with.
In many ways, Macbeth seems to have successfully gotten away with murder. But as we've discussed, no one really ever gets away with anything. It's an idea perhaps best explored in Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. In that novel, another of my personal favorites, the main character, Raskolnikov, also successfully gets away with murder. However, he finds himself so besieged with internal torment, guilt, confusion, paranoia, that he ends up becoming the instrument of his own undoing. Exactly the same thing happens to Macbeth. The first dramatic manifestation occurs when Macbeth's paranoia prompts him to continue the bloodshed. He hires a group of murderers to kill his friend Banquo. After this is done, we find him hosting a dinner in Act 3, Scene 4. It's at this dinner that the full extent of Macbeth's guilt-induced madness becomes apparent, when Banquo's ghost appears at the dinner table, but visible only to Macbeth. There's some ambiguity about this scene that we'll discuss shortly, because it's never made explicitly clear in Shakespeare's text whether the ghost is actually a ghost or whether it's merely the product of Macbeth's own deranged mind. Either way leads to different manifestations of horror. If we imagine the ghost is real, the horror is plain to see. Ghosts are one of the most popular entities in all of horror for good reason. People are terrified of death, and perhaps equally terrified of their uncertainty regarding whether anything exists beyond death. The ghost is a manifestation of that primal fear, but it's also a manifestation of the fears inherent in life. It's generally assumed that ghosts haunt the earth if they've met some sort of violent or untimely end, which was certainly the case with Banquo. To see Banquo's ghost must be a terrifying experience. Not only does it force Macbeth to directly confront the result of his actions in all of his bloody glory, but it also plays with the uncertainty we'd all experience in such a situation. Perhaps the most frightening thing about the ghost is that there's no easy way to deal with it. A ghost is an ethereal being. Lacking corporeal form, its powers are, by their very nature, unknown to us. It's clearly a perversion of nature, but perhaps even more frightening is the question of what one would do if a ghost were to attack. If a person attacks, that might be scary enough, but we have ways to defend ourselves against each other's attacks. How, though, does one defend oneself against a ghost? Zombie stories aside, you can't kill what's already dead. The real horror, though, might occur if we interpret the ghost as existing only in Macbeth's mind. In that case, we transition from supernatural horror to psychological horror, and I, for one, have always found the latter more unsettling. To face an external threat may be a harrowing experience, but to face an internal threat is another matter entirely, particularly when that threat attacks the very fabric of our consciousness. I've always said, for instance, that Alzheimer's disease is fundamentally more frightening than any other illness. Cancer, for instance, may cause a miserable death, but at least my mind would remain intact. Something like Alzheimer's disease robs its victim not only of his life, but of his very self. Therefore, a ghost might be scary to Macbeth, and by extension, scary to the audience. But even more frightening is the idea that the ghost Macbeth sees is not actually there, because that would indicate that his mind has been damaged, perhaps beyond repair.
Round about the cauldron go, in the poisoned entrails throw, toad that under cold stone days and nights has 31, sweltered venom sleeping got, boil thou first in the charmed pot. Double, double toil and trouble, fire burn and cauldron bubble, fillet of a finny snake, in the cauldron boil and bake, eye of newt and toe of frog, wool of bat and tongue of dog, adder's fork and blindworm's sting, lizard's leg and howlet's wing, for a charm of powerful trouble, like a hell broth boil and bubble. Double, double toil and trouble, fire burn and cauldron bubble, scale of dragon, tooth of wolf, witch's mummy, maw and gulf, of the ravined salt sea shark, root of hemlock digged in the dark, liver of blaspheming Jew, gall of goat and slips of yew, slivered in the moon's eclipse, nose of Turk and Tartar's lips, finger of birth-strangled babe, ditch delivered by a drab, make the gruel thick and slab, and thereto a tiger's chaudron, for the ingredients of our cauldron. Double, double, toil and trouble, fire burn and cauldron bubble, cool it with a baboon's blood, then the charm is firm and good.
In today's world, few of us really find witches very frightening. Aside from a relatively small number of Wiccans in the world who practice a religion of witchcraft that really doesn't bear much resemblance to Shakespeare's Weird Sisters, belief in witches is almost down to zero. While it's true that belief in a witchcraft resembling Shakespeare's still does exist in parts of the world, often with disastrous results, those beliefs don't really hit home for those of us in civilized Western society. But Shakespeare lived in different times. Macbeth was written in or around the year 1606. Shakespeare's monarch and patron was James I, himself a staunch believer in the evils of witchcraft, author of a 1597 treatise on the subject called Demonology, and a fierce persecutor of witches. At around the same time, in 1584, Reginald Scot published his Discovery of Witchcraft. This book is a skeptical treatise explaining that the supernatural manifestations of witches can be accounted for by entirely naturalistic explanations. It's also considered the first English language publication to give detailed instructions on magicians' methods. In fact, my fellow magicians and I still perform some of the tricks in this book to this very day. So just what are the witches in Macbeth? There's certainly some sort of commentary on a topical issue of the day, and the literature reveals a debate regarding the reality of witchcraft was raging at the time Shakespeare wrote the play. So how are we to interpret these characters? We can certainly see them as agents of evil. Of that there can be little doubt, and clearly that interpretation falls in line with the king's expectations of what Shakespeare should write. But a good argument can be made that Shakespeare was at least toying with the contrary view that witches are not supernatural beings, but natural tricksters. I'm not the first to suggest that Shakespeare might very well have read Scott's Discovery of Witchcraft. Admittedly, that might or might not have been the easiest task in the world, as the book was widely condemned, including by the king. There are even those who argue he ordered all copies of the book to be destroyed, though this is a less certain allegation. Despite the king's opposition, though, clearly copies of the book survived, and the book remains in print even to this day. Whether Shakespeare actually got his hands on a copy or not, though, it seems entirely reasonable to suspect that he was at the very least aware of the book and aware of its fundamental arguments. Indeed, even as Shakespeare's description of the witches seems completely in line with the believer's perspective that they're supernatural agents of the devil, his actual treatment of them raises more questions than it answers, making them seem perhaps all the more horrifying because their nature is never understood, either by the characters in the play or by the audience. I've said many times that one of the biggest mistakes horror movies make is showing too much of the monster too soon. When we know that there's a monster, we're afraid. Once we actually see the monster, we're less afraid. Many religious and folk magic traditions maintain that there's power in naming things. Once you know something's name, you have power over it. If I see something amorphous and indescribable, I'm going to be afraid of it because my brain doesn't know how to process it. As soon as I can give it a name, though, ghost, skeleton, werewolf, witch, my brain is able to process that information and it becomes less frightening. Even though we can clearly name them as witches, Shakespeare's Weird Sisters live in a more ambiguous realm. We're never clear what their power actually is. It's true that they never really do anything in the play, and yet they also seem to instigate the entire action of the play. The boundaries of their abilities remain shrouded in mystery, and that is why they're frightening. That ambiguity also brings us to our next topic of discussion, the horror of ambiguity itself, which is a constant thread winding its way through Macbeth.
Here's a knocking indeed. If a man were porter of Hellgate, he should have old turn in the key. Knock, knock, knock. Who's there? In the name of Beelzebub. Why, here's a farmer who hanged himself in the expectation of plenty. Come in time. Have napkins enough about you. Here, you'll sweat for it. Knock, knock, knock. Who's there in the other devil's name? Faith, here's an equivocator, who could swear in both the scales against either scale, who committed treason enough for God's sake, yet could not equivocate to heaven. Come in, equivocator.
Equivocation is the use of language to create ambiguity and conceal the truth, and Macbeth is full of it. The idea that equivocation is an element of a horror story, though, may not be immediately obvious, but I think there's a simple case to be made for the idea. Much of horror is rooted in uncertainty, as we've already discussed. We fear the unknown. We fear the dark not because we're afraid of the shadows themselves, but because we're afraid of what monsters might be lurking within them. Though it's certainly no guarantee of safety, knowledge is perhaps the greatest tool we have against those horrors. Equivocation, then, by returning the truth to the shadows, threatens to leave us vulnerable to the world's horrors. Macbeth deals so much with the theme of equivocation that we might even conclude that that's what the play is really all about. Consider the witches. We already briefly addressed the idea that Shakespeare himself may have been engaged in a bit of equivocation with regard to their nature. Were they actually supernatural entities, tricksters? Was Shakespeare in the camp of James I or of Reginald Scott? The play provides precious little textual evidence, leaving the reader or viewer always on uneven ground. Keeping one's audience in the dark is a literary technique that can easily be abused, but it can also be used to create a strong sense of foreboding or even horror, and I would argue that Macbeth is a perfect example of the latter. The witches have a lot to do with equivocation, even within the confines of the play itself, though. The idea is rendered almost explicit when the Weird Sisters themselves proclaim that fair is foul and foul is fair, certainly a form of equivocation. Macbeth even accuses them of equivocation when he refers to them as imperfect speakers. And yet, it is their prophecy that sets off the entire chain of events leading to Macbeth's undoing. Do they genuinely possess the gift of prophecy, or have they merely orchestrated a self-fulfilling prophecy through equivocation? It's entirely unclear. That very uncertainty is a source of significant consternation for Macbeth. Consider his own words upon learning that one of the witch's prophecies, that he was to become the Thane of Cawdor, had come to pass. Two truths are told as happy prologues to the swelling act of the imperial theme. This supernatural soliciting cannot be ill, cannot be good. If ill, why hath it given me earnest of success, commencing in a truth? I am Thane of Cawdor. If good, why do I yield to that suggestion whose horrid image doth unfix my hair and make my seated heart knock at my ribs against the use of nature? Present fears are less than horrible imaginings. My thought, whose murder yet is but fantastical, shakes so my single state of man that function is smothered in surmise, and nothing is but what is not. Happily, as should be the case in any good horror story, this question is never really answered. Though Macbeth's query is partly answered, clearly this supernatural soliciting, as he puts it, was ill rather than good, but its nature remains shrouded in mystery. The equivocation continues when we think about the ambiguity regarding the various ghostly apparitions. Does Banquo's ghost actually visit Macbeth, or is it a hallucination? Either one could be the subject of a horror story, they're just different kinds of horror stories. And again, the play is silent on the matter. In fact, one of the reasons the Teller production of Macbeth that I keep mentioning has become my favorite is because he uses magician's tricks or illusions to make the apparitions appear and disappear on stage, treating the audience to Macbeth's own perspective on the issue. In most productions, it's easy to consider the apparitions as existing only within his mind or as genuinely existing in reality. But when the audience sees them as well, however fleetingly, yet none of the other characters do, this ambiguity is productively magnified. Once again, Macbeth's own words help us to explore Shakespeare's equivocation. While contemplating the, at this time, hypothetical murder of King Duncan, he sees an apparition of a dagger hovering before his eyes, and says, "Is this a dagger which I see before me, the handle toward my hand? Come, let me clutch thee." I have thee not, and yet I see thee still. Art thou not fatal vision, sensible to feeling as to sight? Or art thou but a dagger of the mind, a false creation proceeding from the heat-oppressed brain? I see thee yet, in form as palpable as this which I now draw. Thou marshalst me the way that I was going, and such an instrument I was to use. Mine eyes are made the fools of the other senses, or else worth all the rest. I see thee still, and on thy blade and dungeon gouts of blood which were not so before. There's no such thing. Can we imagine the dagger as some sort of supernatural entity, perhaps somehow teleported into Macbeth's presence by the weird sisters? We easily could, but it's far more interesting to think that it is indeed, in Macbeth's own words, merely a dagger of the mind. And yet, even though he realizes that there's no such thing, he's so corrupted by the witch's equivocations that he has fallen into a kind of self-equivocation. Even if he intellectually understands the dagger to exist only in his mind, he behaves as if it were real. Even if the witch's prophecies are mere equivocations, he behaves as if they're true. There's a valuable idea that what we intellectually believe and what we really believe can be two different things if our behaviors do not match our professed beliefs. Macbeth may intellectually think nothing supernatural is afoot, but he behaves as if he does believe it, and perhaps that's a more meaningful definition of the word belief to begin with. Either way, we can see these equivocations begin to layer one atop the other until neither the audience nor poor Macbeth has any idea what's real and what's not. Shakespeare does give us some clues that this is what he's up to. In the porter scene, the drunken porter explicitly references equivocation and hints at the idea that it can lead to one's ultimate destruction. All the while, his ramblings serve as a form of equivocation themselves, subtly commenting on the play without even mentioning its actual elements. Acting as the porter of hell, he greets several imaginary sinners, each of which represents a different aspect of Macbeth's character. Even the fact that the porter is completely drunk during the scene comments on the play's equivocation. Both intoxicating liquors and equivocation can dull one's senses to reality. And to me, that's perhaps the greatest horror of all. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying we shouldn't have a drink from time to time. Not at all. Nor am I suggesting we shouldn't engage in our flights of fancy. But when one becomes an alcoholic, or when one becomes entirely detached from reality, that's when the horror begins. As I mentioned before, one of the things I fear most, medically speaking, is not something like a virus or a cancer. It's Alzheimer's disease or some other form of dementia. To lose one's grip on reality is perhaps the most terrifying thing I can imagine. That's why sanity plays such a role in Lovecraftian fiction. That equivocation can accomplish exactly that effect, and that Macbeth is centered so prominently on the idea of equivocation would be enough to plant it firmly within the horror genre, even absent all the other elements that we've discussed. So there we have it. I think I've made a case, and hopefully a convincing one, that Macbeth is best understood as a horror story. And yet there's still one more thing that I've neglected to mention. Throughout this entire presentation, I've been referring to Macbeth by its proper title, Macbeth. Not one time have I used the odious moniker, the Scottish play. I suspect at least some of you have objected to this decision because there's one more way we can think of connecting Macbeth to the horrific. The curse. You see, according to theatrical legend, Macbeth is cursed. The legend has it that a coven of witches objected to the play and placed a curse upon it, which has led to a variety of disasters. Alternatively, there are those who believe that the curse has its origin in the Weird Sisters' incantation in the play. According to those people, the poem in the play is a genuine black magic incantation, and this has resulted in the disasters befalling productions ever since. In order to avoid the curse, one must avoid saying the name of the play, Macbeth. Theater people have attempted to protect themselves by calling it the Scottish play, or sometimes the bard's play, instead of by its proper title. Should one accidentally utter the cursed title, so the story goes, one must immediately exit the theater, turn around 3 times, and spit. Well, I've said Macbeth plenty of times today, and I'm not going to perform that ritual. We shall see if I fall victim to a horrible fate as a result. This seems like a good time to say that if you want to see whether I survive this curse or not, you should make sure to subscribe to my channel and ring the notification bell. At some point in the future, I'll be following up this video with another one discussing the Macbeth curse, and we'll determine whether any curse-like things have happened to me. So until then, take care and stay scared.